A black man sees his pregnant ex-wife cleaning tables at his wedding. What he did next shows a gesture of respect and dignity that impresses everyone. The grand ballroom of the downtown hotel buzzed with excitement. The sweet fragrance of fresh flowers drifted through the air, mingling with the savory scent of roasted lamb and freshly baked bread. The sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter filled the space, a perfect backdrop for the wedding of the year. It was James's special day, a moment he had waited for, dreamed of, and planned meticulously. His new bride, Emily, glowed with the brilliance of a woman who was truly in love. Her smile was radiant, her laughter contagious. The golden chandeliers above cast a warm light over the room, reflecting off the polished floors. Guests danced in their elegant evening wear, moving with grace, lost in the rhythm of the music. The long tables were adorned with delicate centerpieces of white lilies and roses, the perfect embodiment of romance and new beginnings. Champagne flowed freely as toasts were made, each clink of the glasses echoing the joy and promise of a future together. James stood near the center of the room, a glass of champagne in hand, though it felt heavy, almost too heavy for him to hold. His eyes moved slowly across the room, greeting familiar faces with the practiced smile of a man who was trying to enjoy the moment, but whose mind was elsewhere. It was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. So why, then, did he feel a weight in his chest? Why did his stomach churn with something cold, something sharp? And then, his gaze froze. There, at the far side of the room, near the entrance, she stood, his ex-wife, Tanya. It wasn't the sight of her that paralyzed him. No, it was the fact that she was working. She wasn't a guest at his wedding, mingling among his friends or exchanging pleasantries with the other attendees. Instead, she was cleaning tables, wiping away crumbs from the linen tablecloths, straightening the glasses on each table, doing the kind of work he had never imagined her doing. His heart slammed in his chest. Tanya, the woman he once loved, the woman he had shared his life with, was here, at his wedding, and she was cleaning up after his guests. She was pregnant. He could see the curve of her belly, unmistakable beneath the plain, unflattering apron she wore. He could see the way she moved, her body carrying the burden of not only her pregnancy but also the weight of the past they shared. It was as if the years had come rushing back in a single, overwhelming wave. The bitterness, the anger, the heartbreak, all of it came crashing down on him in that instant. His chest tightened, and his throat constricted. He could hardly breathe. Her once vibrant smile was gone. Instead, her face was expressionless, hollow, as she continued to perform her duties like a stranger to him. There was no recognition in her eyes when they briefly met. She didn't look at him with the affection he had once cherished, nor the bitterness he had expected. She looked at him as though he was nothing, a passing figure, an afterthought. She was a woman who had moved on, or so it seemed. But why was she here, cleaning tables at his wedding, his celebration? He had known she would be there. He had heard rumors, the whispers of friends who had seen her in town, pregnant and struggling. But none of that had prepared him for this moment, for the sight of her, so close yet so far, so altered from the woman he once knew. He had never imagined that Tanya, the woman he once held in his arms, the woman who had promised to stand by his side through everything, would be reduced to this. The weight of his feelings was unbearable. There was a sharp sting in his chest, a combination of rage, jealousy, and a deep, gnawing sadness. She had left him without warning, without explanation, tearing apart their life together. He had never truly understood why she had walked away. She had simply told him one day, "I need space," and that was it. No more promises. No more future. Just space. And in the years that followed, he had come to understand that she had found someone else, someone who could give her what he could not. He had tried to move on, but there was always a piece of him that remained tethered to her, to the life they had shared, to the broken pieces of a marriage that had once seemed unbreakable. But now, seeing her like this, he realized something. She wasn't just cleaning tables at his wedding. She was cleaning up the pieces of her own life. She was lost, just as he had been, just as they both had been. The warm laughter of the guests seemed distant now. The music that had once been so cheerful now felt like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. The coldness in his chest spread as his gaze drifted back to Tanya. She didn't see him watching her, and for some reason, that made everything worse. She was simply going about her duties, unaware that her presence here was turning his world upside down. His fingers tightened around the stem of the glass, the cool liquid sloshing slightly. He wanted to approach her, to say something, anything. To ask why. To demand answers. But then, a deeper realization struck him. What answers did he really need? Did he really want to dive back into that pain? Did he want to reopen that wound, let the hurt flood back in? No. He didn't. James knew that his life had moved on. He had a new life now, a new wife. He had built something that was worth celebrating. But Tanya's presence here, in this moment, shook him to his core. The realization slowly dawned on him. He was no longer angry. He wasn't filled with rage or resentment. He wasn't even jealous, despite the painful reminder of the life she had now, the pregnancy that wasn't his. No, the feeling that consumed him was sadness, a deep, aching sorrow for both of them. For what they had lost. For what they had failed to hold on to. And then, something inside of him clicked. He didn't need to understand her choices. He didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. There was no more space for anger in his heart, not tonight. Not here, in front of the people who loved him. He had moved on. He had to let go. And tonight, at his wedding, he was going to prove that. Not just to Tanya. Not just to his new wife. But to himself. And so, without another word, James turned away from the sight of his ex-wife and began to walk towards the dance floor, where Emily awaited him. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. But little did he know, his peace was about to be tested in a way he could never have anticipated. James took a deep breath as he stepped onto the dance floor, the sound of the soft violin filling the air as Emily's smile greeted him. But his mind was elsewhere. His eyes wandered back to the corner of the room, where Tanya stood, still cleaning tables, her movements mechanical, as if she were simply going through the motions. The image of her pregnant belly, the way she had silently worked through the evening, seemed to weigh him down. The bitter taste in his mouth wouldn't fade. As Emily reached for his hand, her soft fingers curling around his, he offered her a smile, but it felt strained, like a mask he was forcing himself to wear. Emily was radiant, her blonde hair pulled back in soft waves, her lavender dress hugging her slim frame, but James could barely focus on her. His mind kept flashing back to Tanya, her hollow expression, the way she had looked at him, like she was a ghost of the past. He couldn't shake the image of her, pregnant, cleaning, at his wedding. "You okay?" Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. Her eyes, full of warmth, studied him with concern. Yeah, I'm fine," he murmured, trying to push away the unease creeping into his chest. He pulled her close, their bodies swaying to the gentle rhythm of the song. Emily nestled her head against his shoulder, the scent of her perfume, a mix of lilacs and vanilla, mingling with his thoughts, but the weight of the night remained heavy on him. He had worked so hard to build this life with Emily. Their relationship had blossomed quickly, but it had felt right. Their connection was deep, their love undeniable. Yet, the sight of Tanya, standing there pregnant, cleaning his wedding, had stirred up something he hadn't expected, unresolved grief, lingering wounds that had never fully healed. As they danced, he couldn't help but remember the years he spent with Tanya, the years that had felt like a dream, a life he had thought would last forever. They had built a future together, or at least he thought they had. They had talked about children, about buying a house, about growing old together. But all those dreams had vanished the day she left him. It wasn't a messy breakup. It wasn't filled with angry words or screaming matches. It was a quiet ending, a soft betrayal that he hadn't seen coming. One day, she had simply told him she needed space. She said she was lost, that she didn't know who she was anymore. And just like that, she had walked away. James had tried to move on. He had tried to understand, to forgive, but the pain lingered. The trust had been shattered, and no matter how hard he worked to rebuild his life, the absence of Tanya's love still haunted him. And now, seeing her there, pregnant, working at his wedding, it was like all the years of hurt had been bottled up and shaken, ready to explode. His mind began to drift back to the difficult days after their separation. He had buried himself in his work, thinking that time would heal the wound, but it hadn't. There had been nights where he would sit alone, drinking whiskey and staring at the empty space next to him in bed, wishing she would come back. But she never did. The pain was like a constant ache, something he had gotten used to but never truly healed. When he met Emily, she had been a breath of fresh air, someone who didn't carry the weight of his past with her. She loved him without reservation, and he had fallen for her quickly. Yet, deep down, he feared he was still carrying the ghost of Tanya with him. His gaze once again found Tanya, now bent down, wiping the floor by the farthest table. There was a sadness in her that struck him deeper than he cared to admit. She wasn't the confident, fiery woman he once knew. She was different now, worn, weary, as if life had chewed her up and spit her out. Her eyes avoided his, but they didn't look angry. They looked tired. Almost empty. What had happened to her? Where had she gone after walking away from him? Was the life she had built after their marriage truly what she had wanted? Or was she, like him, just pretending to be okay? For a fleeting moment, James wondered if he had been too hard on her. If he had blamed her for everything without understanding the full picture. He had never asked her what had happened, never understood why she had felt the need to leave. They had both been at fault, in their own ways, for the collapse of their marriage. It wasn't that he wanted her back. No, he had long let go of that idea. He had chosen Emily, and he would never hurt her like that. But the sight of Tanya, struggling in the background of his most important day, awakened a sense of empathy he hadn't expected. He couldn't help but wonder, what if things could have been different for both of us? But no matter what those thoughts stirred inside him, the reality remained, she wasn't a part of his life anymore. And he was with Emily now, and he owed it to her, no, to himself, to finally let go of the past. It was then that the realization hit him, I need to forgive her. But I also need to forgive myself. As he danced with Emily, he made a decision. He would talk to Tanya. He would finally give her the closure he had never allowed himself to have. But more importantly, he would do it without bitterness, without anger. He would do it to free himself, to move on completely from the past that had held him hostage for so long. James wasn't sure how Tanya would react. He wasn't sure what he would say. But he knew one thing, whatever the outcome, he had to do this. He had to let go of the anger, of the blame. He had to find peace, true peace, in his heart. As the dance came to an end, James pulled away gently, his hands still resting on Emily's waist. He kissed her softly on the cheek, a moment of quiet intimacy amidst the chaos. She smiled at him, her eyes warm with affection. But inside, his mind was already made up. It was time to confront the past, not with anger or resentment, but with compassion and understanding. And as he turned to find Tanya again, he had no idea that his decision would lead to a shocking revelation that would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he once loved. The night carried on in a blur of music, laughter, and fleeting moments. James couldn't shake the image of Tanya, her pregnant belly still visible beneath the simple apron, as if she were invisible in the grand hall of his wedding. As the evening wore on, he excused himself from the dance floor, telling Emily he needed some air. She smiled, unaware of the inner turmoil he was grappling with, and nodded. James stepped out onto the balcony, where the cool night air greeted him with a sharp gust. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but they did little to brighten the weight pressing on his chest. He looked over his shoulder and saw Tanya still cleaning, her movements slow, methodical. It was almost as if she were trapped in time, a ghost of the woman he once knew. Without thinking, James made his way inside the ballroom again, his steps purposeful, each one carrying him closer to a past that had never truly left him. He didn't know what he would say to her, or even how he would start. But something inside him told him that this conversation was necessary, not just for closure, but for his own peace. He needed to see her, to finally understand. When he reached her, she was bent down, wiping the floor by a table near the back. Her face was still unreadable, lost in the task at hand. She didn't notice him approach, her focus entirely on the job she was doing. James hesitated for a moment, watching her. She looked so different now, tired, almost defeated. Tanya had been a force of nature when they were together. She was fierce, independent, full of dreams and ambitions. But now, she seemed smaller, worn out by a life that wasn't as kind as it had promised to be. James cleared his throat, and she looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. There was no anger there, no resentment. Just a quiet, distant sorrow. "James," she said softly, her voice low and almost broken. It wasn't a greeting. It was just an acknowledgement of his presence. She didn't smile, but her eyes seemed to soften for a brief moment. "Tanya," James began, the words catching in his throat. "What are you doing here?" "At my wedding, and why are you cleaning?" She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on the apron. Her expression was still guarded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite decipher. "I'm working," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed the money." Her words hung in the air, heavy with a pain James couldn't ignore. She wasn't even looking at him now, her gaze fixed on the floor as she shifted her weight uncomfortably. "I don't belong here, James," she added quietly. "I didn't want to be a distraction." James felt a lump form in his throat. The words she spoke felt like a confession, as if she had been carrying this burden for far too long. "Tanya," he took a step closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "You don't have to hide. You don't have to be ashamed of who you are. Not here. Not now." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, her face a mix of vulnerability and defiance. "You have everything, James," she said, her voice sharp for the first time. "You moved on. You have Emily. You've built a life. And she trailed off, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her words was too much to carry. "I've been struggling. I've been trying to find my way back to something I lost. And I thought I'd come here, just to see you again. To see if I could find some peace." James's chest tightened, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had never expected this. He had never expected her to speak to him like this, vulnerable, lost. Tanya had always been the strong one, the one with the answers. But now, she was just like him, searching for something, anything, to make sense of a life that had unraveled. "I didn't know," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know you were going through all of this. I thought you were fine. I thought you had everything under control." Tanya shook her head slowly, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "That's what I wanted you to think. I wanted you to believe I was okay. I didn't want to be weak. But, James, she paused, her voice trembling now. I'm not okay. And I haven't been for a long time. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken emotions, regret, confusion, a sense of helplessness that neither of them had ever fully acknowledged. James stared at Tanya, realizing in that moment how much he had underestimated the pain she had carried with her. For so long, he had been angry, blaming her for the end of their marriage, for the emptiness that followed. But now, facing her like this, he understood. She had been lost, just like him. He reached out, a tentative hand extended toward her. Tanya, he began, his voice calm but firm. I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I should have been there for you. I should have fought harder, not just for us, but for you. I never wanted you to feel like you had to carry this alone. She took a step back, as if startled by his words. It's too late for apologies, James, she whispered. We've both moved on. We've both built lives we never thought we'd have. James paused, the truth of her words sinking in. He had moved on. He had Emily now. And Tanya, she had her own life, her own path to walk. They couldn't go back. The past was too far gone. But even in this painful, raw moment, James realized something. He didn't need to forgive her for himself. He needed to forgive himself for not understanding sooner. He needed to let go of the guilt, the blame that had followed him all these years. And as Tanya's eyes met his, he finally found the courage to say what had been on his heart for so long. I forgive you, Tanya. I don't know what happened, and maybe I never will. But I forgive you. Tanya blinked, as though the weight of his words had taken her by surprise. And in that moment, James realized this was the closure he had been searching for. Not in the answers, not in the past, but in the forgiveness. And little did he know, the greatest lesson of all was about to come in a way that would change everything. James stood there, facing Tanya, his heart pounding in his chest. The words had just escaped his lips, and the weight of them hung in the air, a thin thread of understanding that, for a brief moment, seemed to pull them together. He had told her that he forgave her, but he was still unsure of the full weight of what that meant. They both knew, deep down, that they couldn't undo the past, no matter how much they wished they could. For a long moment, Tanya stood in silence, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond immediately to his words of forgiveness, and James wasn't sure if he should press her further or just let the moment breathe. The sound of clinking silverware and soft chatter from the ballroom felt like a distant hum in the background, a reminder of how out of place this conversation felt in the midst of what should have been the happiest day of his life. The tension between them was palpable, a fragile bridge being built from both sides, but neither of them sure if it would hold. James, Tanya's voice was quiet, almost fragile. She hesitated, as if the words she was about to say were tangled in her throat. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted things to end like that. But, there's something you don't know. James's breath caught in his chest. His eyes searched her face, but he couldn't read the expression there. Tanya looked conflicted, torn between the past and whatever truth she was holding onto. What do you mean? He asked softly, stepping a bit closer, sensing that whatever she was about to say was important, perhaps more important than he was prepared for. Tanya's eyes darted to the side, avoiding his gaze. She bit her lip, the tension in her body betraying the calm facade she had been trying to maintain. I should have told you this a long time ago, she began, her voice wavering. But I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you more than I already had. James felt his pulse quicken, an unease creeping up his spine. Tanya, you're scaring me. What is it? Her eyes finally met his, and there was something in them, something James couldn't quite place, something raw and vulnerable. I wasn't just running away from you, James. I wasn't just walking away from our marriage, she paused, taking a breath, her eyes misting over. I was pregnant. When I left you, I was already carrying our child. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. His world seemed to tilt, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had never expected this. His mind spun, trying to process the gravity of what Tanya had just revealed. She had been carrying their child when she left? It was a truth that shook him to his core. But, why? James asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you keep the child? Tanya closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, James. I felt so lost. I thought I was better off on my own. I thought I was protecting the both of us by leaving. I didn't want to bring a child into the mess of everything. James couldn't find the words to respond. The revelation left him paralyzed, stuck between shock and a deep, searing pain. A child. Their child. Tanya had carried a part of him all those months, and he had never known. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his emotions, but they were all over the place. How could she do this? His mind kept asking. But another part of him, his heart, was beginning to understand. He had blamed her for everything. He had been angry, confused, even bitter. But the truth of her struggle, the terror and the pain she had carried alone, was something he could not ignore. A strange silence fell over them, the air between them thick with the unspoken. Tanya wiped her eyes, her face tight with regret. I know you must hate me, she said quietly, her voice full of self-loathing. And I don't blame you if you do. James shook his head slowly, his mind still reeling. He didn't hate her. He couldn't hate her. What she had done, the way she had kept this from him, hurt more than anything, but in his heart, he couldn't feel hatred. It was a deep, profound sadness that seemed to fill him completely. He had spent so long blaming her, pushing her away, not understanding what she had gone through. No, he said finally, his voice steady but full of sorrow. I don't hate you. I don't know what to feel right now. I don't know how to process all of this. Tanya looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron nervously. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. But I had to tell you. I couldn't leave without you knowing the truth. I owe you that much. James stared at her, the weight of her confession settling in like a stone in his chest. He had thought he understood the situation, that he had come to terms with their past. But now, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He had never expected this, never imagined that there was something so deep, so personal, that Tanya had carried in silence. The realization hit him with a force he wasn't prepared for. This wasn't just about their failed marriage. It was about something more. Something deeper that they both needed to confront. But as James stood there, grappling with his emotions, he didn't realize that this moment of raw honesty would be the spark that would ignite the most unexpected revelation of all. What Tanya had just confessed, about their child, about her reasons for leaving, was just the beginning. The truth she had been hiding from him for years had already begun to unravel, and James had no idea just how far the truth would take him. The revelation Tanya had shared hung in the air like a heavy fog, neither of them sure how to move through it. James stood there, struggling to reconcile the truth that had just been thrust upon him. He had spent years building a new life, a life that, for all its beauty, felt incomplete now in the face of this new information. He couldn't stop thinking about the child he never knew existed, the child that had once been part of their future. James? Tanya's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him back into the present. Her eyes were pleading, desperate for understanding. I know this is a lot to take in. But I couldn't go on without you knowing. James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had always been the type to analyze, to process before reacting, but this was different. This wasn't about facts, about what could be logically explained. This was about raw emotion, about a deep wound that he hadn't realized had been festering for years. "I don't hate you," James finally said, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if I can ever understand it all. But I don't hate you." Tanya's face softened, but her eyes still held that sorrowful weight. "I didn't want to hurt you, James. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought if I left, if I just disappeared for a while, maybe you could move on, live a life without the mess of everything I was going through." James shook his head slowly, the confusion and anger slowly dissipating as understanding began to take root. "But we could have figured it out together. We didn't have to be apart. You should have told me about the pregnancy, Tanya. We could have found a way, even if it was hard." "I was scared," she whispered, the words breaking through the veil of her composure. "I didn't think you would want me anymore, not with a child, not after everything that happened. I thought you'd blame me, and maybe, part of me blamed myself too." James could feel his chest tightening as he absorbed the pain she had been carrying. He had blamed her for the end of their marriage, blamed her for abandoning him when they could have fought through their problems. But hearing her speak now, hearing the rawness in her voice, made him realize that he had never understood the depths of her struggle. "I never blamed you," James said softly, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the past. "I blamed myself. For not seeing what you were going through. For not being there when you needed me the most." Tanya looked up at him, her eyes wide, as if surprised by his words. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand reaching out as if to bridge the gap between them. "James, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to be like this. I should have told you, I should have trusted you." James stepped closer, his own hand extending toward hers, but he stopped just shy of touching it. Something inside him knew that while forgiveness was possible, moving forward with her was not. They had both changed, and their paths had diverged so far that there was no turning back. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us," James said, his voice tinged with sadness. "But I'm here, Tanya. I'm here, and I'm listening. That's all I can offer now." Tanya's face crumpled in sorrow, but then, as if by some miracle, she smiled, a bittersweet smile, but a smile nonetheless. It wasn't a smile of relief, or of closure, but one that reflected the weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she wasn't alone in her pain. "I never stopped loving you, James," she whispered. "But I know now that I have to let go. For both of us." The words hung between them, the finality in them palpable. James could feel the sting of her admission, but he knew it was the only way. They both had to let go. She had already moved on in her own way. She had found a place in her life where she could begin to heal, even if it meant standing in this ballroom, cleaning tables at the wedding of the man she once loved. James knew that he had found his own way of moving forward, too. Emily was beside him, her love and support a lifeline in the storm of emotions he'd been drowning in. But this, standing here in this strange, surreal moment with Tanya, was where the healing would begin. And then, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift, James turned toward the exit, taking a step toward the future that awaited him. But before he could fully turn away, Tanya's voice stopped him. "James," she called, her tone urgent. "There's one more thing. Something I should have told you before. Something that might change everything." James paused, his body tensing with uncertainty. He turned back to her, his face a mix of curiosity and caution. "What do you mean?" Tanya's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of a nearby chair for support. I didn't just leave because I was scared. The reason I left," she took a deep breath, her gaze locking with his, as though preparing herself for the hardest thing she would ever say. "I was forced to leave. It wasn't just my decision. I had to. James's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him like a thunderclap. What are you talking about? His voice was low, almost frantic with the intensity of the moment. Tanya's eyes filled with tears again, her voice barely a whisper. I was forced out of the city by someone you know. And they told me, if I didn't leave you, if I didn't disappear from your life, they would destroy everything we had. James froze. The world around him seemed to stop moving. Who? But Tanya's next words would shake him to the core, shaking the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about his life. The room felt suffocating, the weight of Tanya's words pressing down on James, squeezing the air from his lungs. The hum of the wedding reception had faded into the background, as if the universe itself had silenced the noise to give space for this moment. James stared at Tanya, his mind racing, trying to process the truth she had just revealed. Someone forced her to leave? His eyes searched her face, desperate for clarity. Who? He demanded, his voice shaky with a mix of disbelief and fear. Who would do this? Tanya took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as they rested on the back of the chair. She looked away briefly, as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear, and when she spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. You know him, she said, her voice breaking. You've known him for years. It was your father. The words landed like a thunderclap, and for a moment, everything stopped. The ground beneath James's feet seemed to crumble, and the room felt as if it were spinning. His father. The man who had always been the steady presence in his life, the one he had looked up to, the one who had taught him everything about being strong, being a man. His father? James couldn't process it at first. His mind rejected the idea, tried to convince him it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But Tanya's expression told him she wasn't lying. She was broken, trembling, her tears flowing freely now. He threatened me, Tanya continued, her voice thick with emotion. He said if I didn't leave you, if I didn't disappear from your life, he would make sure I lost everything. My career, my family, everything. He made it clear that I wouldn't be safe. And he didn't stop there. He said that he would make sure you never knew the truth. He told me to disappear, to walk away, or there would be consequences. James's heart hammered in his chest, every beat echoing in his ears. His father, the man he trusted most in the world, had done this? Had forced the woman he loved to leave him, all to protect some dark secret? The shock of it all was overwhelming, and for a long moment, James couldn't speak. His father's voice, always so calm and authoritative, now felt like a distant memory, distorted by the horrifying reality of what he was capable of. Tanya, sensing his struggle, looked down at the floor, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I didn't want to believe it either, James. But when he showed up at my apartment, when he made it clear how far he was willing to go, I had no choice. I thought it was the only way. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us. James took a step back, his mind racing through a flood of thoughts and emotions. How could he have never known? How could his father, the man he had always admired, have done something so vile? His heart ached for Tanya, but it was also full of rage, rage at the injustice she had endured, rage at the man who had manipulated their lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. His mind spun, trying to understand what it all meant, what he was supposed to do with this newfound knowledge. I can't believe this, he whispered, more to himself than to Tanya. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tightening with the flood of emotions. I've spent years hating you for leaving me. And now I find out it was all a lie. My father, he's the one who destroyed everything. Tanya nodded, her tears flowing freely now. I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry. But I needed you to know the truth. You deserve to know what really happened. James looked at her, his heart torn. In that moment, he saw her not just as the woman who had left him, but as a person who had been victimized, who had been manipulated and forced into a decision she didn't want to make. She wasn't the villain in this story. His father was. And now, James had to make a choice. He had to decide what to do with this truth, and what it meant for his future. Taking a deep breath, James exhaled slowly, a sense of clarity washing over him. The anger, the betrayal, and the confusion had started to fade, replaced by something more profound. He looked at Tanya, his gaze softening. "You didn't deserve any of this. None of it." Tanya looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes reflecting a quiet relief. "I've carried this guilt for so long, James. But now I know I can't carry it anymore." James stepped closer to her, his heart heavy but also full of understanding. "You don't have to carry it anymore. You don't have to carry any of it." He paused for a moment, his mind racing. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of his father's expectations, always trying to please him, always seeking his approval. But now, as the truth came crashing down on him, he knew that the man he had looked up to had betrayed him in ways he couldn't undo. But what he could do was break free. Break free from the lies, from the manipulation, from the chains that had bound him to a false reality. Tanya's betrayal had never been her own. It had been orchestrated by someone else. He could feel the chains of his past breaking as he spoke, the words coming with a sense of finality, a new resolve. "I won't go back to him," James said firmly. "I won't let him control me anymore. He doesn't get to decide my life. He doesn't get to decide who I love, who I trust, or who I forgive." Tanya looked at him, her expression one of disbelief and gratitude. "James, what are you going to do?" He smiled, a slow, steady smile. "I'm going to live for myself. I'm going to move on from this, but I'm not going to forget. I'll forgive him, but I won't let him back into my life. I will rebuild. And I will find peace." With those final words, James turned and walked out of the ballroom, a man reborn. The pain of the past would always linger, but now, he could see the future clearly, a future not defined by the lies or the betrayals of his past, but by his own choices. And for the first time in years, he felt free. But just as he reached the door, he stopped. A thought struck him, a decision made in the moment, but one that felt right. He turned back toward Tanya, his expression softer now, less burdened by the weight of old wounds. "Tanya, wait." His voice was calm, steady. She turned to face him, her tired eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't want you to think that I hate you. I don't. And I don't want your child to suffer because of mistakes, mine, yours, or his." He hesitated, then added, "The father of your baby isn't in the picture, right?" Tanya's lips trembled slightly, but she said nothing. She just nodded, her hands instinctively resting on her stomach. James took a breath before continuing. "But I want to help you, whether it's with a job, some money, or anything else you might need." At that moment, James felt a familiar presence beside him. Emily. She had been standing nearby, having caught parts of their conversation. More importantly, she remembered what James had told her before, about his father, about the pain of abandonment, about the cycle he had sworn to break. She slipped her hand into his and looked at him, her expression full of quiet understanding. "If you want to help her, then we will," Emily said softly, her words carrying no hesitation, no resentment, only kindness. James turned to her, searching her face, and when he saw her unwavering support, he felt something deep inside him settle. He nodded. "Yeah. We should." Tanya's eyes welled up with tears. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Emily reassured her. "Just know that you're not alone. James met Tanya's gaze one last time, offering a small but genuine smile. "We'll figure this out together." For the first time in a long while, Tanya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. And as James and Emily walked out of the ballroom, hand in hand, he knew one thing for certain: the past would not define him. The future was his to shape.